Genesis. Abacab. Yeah. If you were from the 80s, you loved that song. And if you were from the 80s, you always wondered, where in the hell did the title come from? Well, it just so happens that I have the answer to that question handy, and I'm going to impart it onto you. It also just so happens that the answer to that question relates perfectly to what I want to talk about today. Let's take a look at that title of the song. Abacab. A-B-A-C-A-B. Have you figured it out yet? That's right. The title has to do with the structure of the song. Even dating way back to classical music and romantic music and Baroque music, music was always broken up into sections, and those sections were A, B, C, D. So songs would have an A section, then they would have a B section. They'd often go back to the A section, then they might have a C section, and you can see where this is going. Abacab, A-B-A-C-A-B. The sections, the structure of a song. And it just so happens that stories, books, screenplays, stage plays, short stories, novels, monologues, they all have a structure, and the structure is often incredibly similar. I'm going to tell you about the structure right now. The beginning of a book is often called the exposition. The exposition is where the characters in the story is in a state of equilibrium. That means everything is normal. You can introduce your characters and their backstory, and you can introduce their relationships and blah, 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 blah in the exposition portion of the story. This is where you're introducing your readers to your world. Now, the exposition, the action rises and falls, and it gets to the single most important aspect of your story. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the inciting incident. It is the inciting incident. It is the point at which your character does what he does. It is the point of no return. That thing that kicks the action of the story off. Now, there are exceptions to the rules, and I'll tell you an exception right now. If you think about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his Sherlock Holmes stories, most of those stories begin with the murder already happening. So the inciting incident of these stories happened before the book began. And that's okay. You start your book off with your characters and your stories out of a state of equilibrium. Well, there was a reason for that, and that was people back then didn't want to read the gruesome details of a murder. Very simply, you have it happen before it starts. But today's audience are okay with that. And we're used to building up to the inciting incident and moving on. What happens after the inciting incident? Well, the action of your story then rises and falls, but it builds slowly in a well pace, and it hits the climax. Ha ha ha! Weak, weak, nudge, nudge, you dirty, sexy little people out there. I'm not talking about that kind of climax, well, unless you happen to write, the big sexy erotica. Ooh. Then, well, I suppose you would have a bunch of little climaxes building up to one big climax. But anyway, you get what I mean. The climax of your story, for example, is when your main character finally meets up with the big bad and they have their huge, ginormous battle, and in the end, the good guy wins. Unless your protagonist happens to be the bad guy, then the bad guy wins. Or you could put a twist on it, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so the climax happens. What's next? Well, the action of the story rises and falls, but it generally goes down into what is called the denouement. That's a great word, isn't it? The denouement is the resolution. It is the action that pulls us, the story, and the characters back into what? Can you guess it? You in the back row, raise your hand. Equilibrium. So what we've done is we've started our story in a state of equilibrium. We've hit the inciting incident, which causes our story to start. It kicks us off. We've reached the climax, and then we come back down into a state of equilibrium. Now, the denouement and coming back to a state of equilibrium doesn't necessarily have to bring us to a happily ever after. You can resolve your story into a cliffhanger, or your main character can come to a bad demise. Whatever, it's up to you. It's your story. Now, how do you put this into work, into action? How do you make this part of your process? Well, let's say that you're a plotter. You have to outline your story. You can, and I highly recommend this, before you even begin plotting out the story, before you put your bullet points in, make sure that on your outline you put inciting incident, climax, denouement, or resolution. You can call it whichever one you want. I prefer denouement because it's a fancier term. Thank you very much. Anyway, plot those out and then connect the dots in between them with your storyline. If you're a pantser like myself, you sit down at your keyboard and you just start going, and wherever the story takes you is where you go. You still have to keep your mind on the idea that you have to have those elements of the story. So make sure that as you're writing along, you hit an inciting incident, and then that inciting incident builds up to a climax, and then after the climax you resolve into a state of equilibrium. Now, you can watch that in action if you go to a movie. If you've read enough film reviews, you have heard reviewers speak of acts. Every movie has an act, and most movies are in 3 acts. The first act is the exposition and the inciting incident. The second act is the climax, and the third act is the resolution or the denouement. Now you can see how that all comes together into one big cohesive whole. Now, it's very important that you have these elements, whether you're writing a short story, a noveletta, a novelle, a full-length novel, a screenplay, a stage play, even a monologue, which happens to be the single hardest piece of literature to write. Just make sure that you have these elements, and if you don't, you need to figure out a way to work them into your story. Of course, as we know, all rules are made to be broken. It's up to you in the end. But if you want a solid structure in your story, consider these items. Consider what I've said. And consider yourself lucky that I'm not going to keep on babbling on ad infinitum. Instead, I'm going to air drum my way out of here. Thank you, Genesis and Abacab. And ladies and gentlemen of the Jackverse, I will see you again. Thank you very much.